There's something uniquely terrifying about the moment when faith reveals its true face, when devotion becomes danger, when spiritual seeking transforms into spiritual manipulation, when ancient traditions are twisted to serve modern evil. In our quest for meaning and belonging, we sometimes find ourselves in places where the line between salvation and sacrifice becomes frighteningly thin. During my investigations into unexplained phenomena, I've discovered that some of the most chilling premonitions occur within religious and spiritual communities, spaces where our critical thinking is deliberately suppressed in favor of blind trust. Perhaps it's the vulnerability that comes with surrendering our skepticism. Perhaps it's the way charismatic leaders can manipulate our deepest needs for purpose and community. Or perhaps evil gravitates toward these environments precisely because they offer such perfect cover. Today I share two accounts from individuals who found themselves in spiritual communities that harbored deadly secrets. Both experienced premonitions that revealed the horrific reality hiding beneath facades of enlightenment and tradition. Both had to choose between maintaining their cover and saving lives. The first comes from David Chen, an investigative journalist who spent 6 months infiltrating the Children of the New Dawn, an apocalyptic cult that promised spiritual transformation but delivered something far darker. The second, from Sarah Williams, a travel blogger who attended what she thought was an authentic cultural festival in rural Mexico, only to discover that some traditions are too dangerous to preserve. These testimonies were recorded in secure locations, with identities protected for obvious reasons. Both individuals still carry the psychological scars of their experiences, but both felt compelled to share their stories as warnings about the thin line between spiritual seeking and spiritual predation. What makes their accounts particularly disturbing is how their premonitions detected not just immediate danger, but entire systems of manipulation designed to make rational people commit irrational acts. The threats they sensed weren't just physical violence, but the deliberate corruption of human spirituality in service of evil intentions. Listen to these accounts and ask yourself, in our search for meaning and community, how do we distinguish between authentic spiritual experience and sophisticated psychological manipulation? When faith demands the suspension of reason, how do we recognize when that suspension has gone too far? Story 1. The journalist's infiltration account of David Chen, 34 years old, investigative journalist. My name is David Chen, and I spent 6 months of my life pretending to believe that the end of the world was a beautiful thing. I was researching an article about modern doomsday cults for Rolling Stone magazine when I infiltrated the Children of the New Dawn, a religious community that promised its members would ascend to a higher plane of existence when society collapsed. What I discovered was that their leader wasn't waiting for society to collapse naturally. He was planning to help it along, one mass murder at a time. The Children of the New Dawn operated out of a compound in rural Montana, about 60 miles from the nearest town. From the outside, it looked like any other intentional community. Organic gardens, solar panels, modest buildings arranged around a central meeting hall. The 120 residents appeared to be ordinary people seeking alternatives to mainstream society. But appearances in cult environments are always deceiving. I arrived at the compound in March, posing as a disillusioned tech worker searching for spiritual meaning after a fictional divorce. The recruitment process was sophisticated. They didn't immediately welcome outsiders or pressure anyone to join. Instead, they invited seekers to attend weekend workshops on sustainable living and spiritual development. The workshops were impressive. Professional presentations about permaculture, meditation sessions led by charismatic teachers, and group discussions about building intentional communities. If I hadn't been there as an investigator, I might have been genuinely attracted to their message. But I was watching for the manipulation techniques that cult experts had taught me to recognize. The love bombing phase where new members receive overwhelming positive attention, the gradual isolation from outside relationships, the introduction of increasingly extreme beliefs through small incremental steps. The leader, who called himself Prophet Ezekiel, but whose real name was Robert Morrison, was a master of these techniques. He was in his 50s, with the kind of commanding presence that made people want to please him. During group meetings, he could speak for hours about spiritual transformation, environmental collapse, and the special role his followers would play in humanity's evolution. What bothered me from the beginning was how much his teachings focused on death. According to Prophet Ezekiel, the current world was irredeemably corrupt and needed to be cleansed before the spiritually pure could inherit the earth. This wasn't unusual theology for apocalyptic groups, but Ezekiel went further. He taught that the faithful might need to help accelerate the cleansing process to prevent the innocent from being corrupted by a dying society. It was a subtle distinction, but it transformed passive apocalyptic belief into justification for active violence. The premonition started during my third week at the compound. I was attending a leadership meeting. I'd been invited because Ezekiel saw potential in my spiritual development. We were discussing plans for expanding the community's outreach programs, apparently innocent. Activities like organizing workshops in nearby towns and recruiting new members. But as Ezekiel spoke about sharing our message with the wider world, I suddenly saw something that wasn't happening in the room. I saw Ezekiel standing in what looked like a church sanctuary, speaking to a crowd of maybe 200 people. But these weren't his usual followers. These were ordinary citizens, families with children, elderly people, teenagers. They were listening to him speak about spiritual transformation and the beauty of transcending physical existence. In the vision, I could see armed members of the children scattered throughout the crowd, positioned at exits and along the walls. They were calm, almost serene, as if what they were about to do was the most natural thing in the world. Then I saw Ezekiel give a subtle signal, and his followers began producing weapons, not guns, but syringes filled with some kind of clear liquid. They moved through the crowd, methodically, injecting people who trusted them, who had come seeking spiritual guidance and instead found death disguised as enlightenment. The vision lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like hours. When I returned to the present, Ezekiel was looking directly at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Brother David," he said, "you seem troubled. Are you receiving revelations about our mission?" I realized that my facial expression during the vision had been visible to everyone in the room. In cult environments, any unusual behavior is interpreted through the lens of spiritual experience. "I saw us sharing our message with many people," I said carefully, "but there was something about the way it ended that felt significant." Ezekiel smiled. "The transition to the next plane of existence is always significant, Brother David. Some souls are ready to ascend immediately, while others need assistance releasing their attachment to physical form. It was the first time I'd heard him explicitly reference what I was now certain was planned mass murder. Over the next 2 weeks, I gathered more details about what Ezekiel called the Great Transition. The plan was elegantly simple and horrifyingly effective. The children would organize public seminars in churches and community centers throughout Montana and Idaho, advertising them as workshops on spiritual development and environmental sustainability. The seminars would attract exactly the kind of people cults typically target: individuals going through life transitions, people seeking meaning, families concerned about the future. But instead of recruitment events, these gatherings would become mass poisoning operations. The weapon was a concentrated solution of sodium pentobarbital, a veterinary euthanasia drug that could be administered through injection or aerosol dispersal. Ezekiel had convinced his followers that they would be helping people achieve spiritual liberation by freeing them from the suffering of physical existence before the world collapsed. It was Jonestown methodology adapted for the social media age, designed to kill hundreds of people across multiple locations simultaneously. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the planned violence, but how thoroughly Ezekiel had convinced his followers that mass murder was an act of compassion. During preparation meetings, they spoke about the poisoning operations with the same tone they used for discussing garden maintenance or meal preparation. I realized I was trapped in a community where rational people had been systematically transformed into willing accomplices to genocide. My breaking point came during a rehearsal session, where the children practiced their roles for the upcoming seminars. I watched ordinary people, teachers, nurses, former professionals, calmly discussing the logistics of killing families while believing they were performing spiritual service. That night, I used a satellite phone hidden in my belongings to contact the FBI field office in Billings. But I faced a terrible dilemma. If I revealed my location and the Bureau moved immediately, Ezekiel would know there was an informant in the compound. If any of his followers escaped, they could still carry out attacks at other locations. But if I waited for more evidence, people would die. I chose to compromise my investigation to save lives. This is David Chen, investigative, journalist. I'm calling to report an imminent terrorist threat. A religious group called the Children of the New Dawn is planning coordinated mass poisoning attacks at public seminars scheduled for next week. The agent who took my call was professional, but skeptical. Mr. Chen, what evidence do you have of these planned attacks? I've been undercover in their compound for 5 weeks. I've attended planning meetings where they discussed logistics for killing approximately 800 people across multiple locations. Are you currently in danger? Yes, and so is everyone who attends their public seminars next week. The FBI response was swift and comprehensive, but not subtle. Within 18 hours, the compound was surrounded by federal agents, and I was extracted along with evidence that confirmed everything I'd reported. The raid prevented the mass poisoning attacks, but it also revealed the true scope of Ezekiel's operation. The Children of the New Dawn had been planning similar attacks in 6 other states, coordinated to occur simultaneously and create maximum psychological impact. If successful, the attacks would have killed over 2,000 people and represented the largest domestic terrorism event in U.S. history. Ezekiel and 37 of his followers were charged with conspiracy to commit mass murder. The trials revealed that the cult had been preparing for the attacks for over 2 years, stockpiling weapons and poison while maintaining their facade as a peaceful spiritual community. But here's what still haunts me. Most of the followers genuinely believed they were planning acts of mercy. Even after arrest, even during trials, many of them maintained that they had been trying to save people from the suffering of living in a corrupt world. Ezekiel had created a reality distortion field so complete that rational people became willing to commit mass murder while believing they were performing acts of love. The article I eventually wrote for Rolling Stone focused on the psychological techniques used to transform ordinary people into potential killers. But I never mentioned the vision that had shown me exactly what they were planning before I'd gathered any concrete evidence. How do you explain that your investigation succeeded because you saw a mass murder that hadn't happened yet? How do you tell editors that your most important source was a premonition? Since leaving the compound, I've struggled with questions about faith, community, and the human need for belonging. The Children of the New Dawn weren't obviously crazy people. They were seekers who'd been systematically manipulated into surrendering their critical thinking in exchange for purpose and community. The scariest realization was how close I came to believing parts of their ideology myself. When you're isolated, when you're surrounded by people who share the same beliefs, when you're told daily that you're part of something special and important, it becomes difficult to maintain perspective. If I hadn't been there as a journalist with a specific mission, if I hadn't had that vision showing me where their teachings led, I might have become another willing participant in Ezekiel's planned genocide. I've covered 3 more cult-related stories since then, but I've never again infiltrated a group for extended periods. The psychological cost is too high, and the risk of losing yourself in someone else's twisted reality is too real. But I learned something important about recognizing dangerous spiritual communities. They always promise that violence is necessary for higher purposes. Whether it's cleansing the world, protecting the innocent, or accelerating spiritual evolution, they frame murder as mercy and manipulation as enlightenment. The most effective defense against spiritual predators is maintaining the ability to distinguish between authentic wisdom and sophisticated lies, even when those lies are wrapped in beautiful language about love, transcendence, and higher purpose. Have you ever found yourself in a community where the price of belonging was surrendering your ability to question what you were being taught? Have you ever sensed that someone was using spiritual language to justify terrible actions? David's experience reveals how spiritual manipulation can transform ordinary people into accomplices to evil. But what happens when that same corrupting influence operates within ancient traditions that entire communities accept as sacred? What happens when cultural preservation becomes a cover for practices that should have been abandoned centuries ago? Story 2. The Tourist's Revelation. Account of Sarah Williams, 31 years old, travel blogger. My name is Sarah Williams, and I document authentic cultural experiences for travelers seeking alternatives to mainstream tourism. I've attended ceremonies in Nepal, festivals in Peru, and rituals in dozens of countries where ancient traditions survive in modern times. I thought I understood the difference between cultural preservation and cultural exploitation. I was wrong about what some traditions actually preserve. The incident occurred in the village of Santa Muerte, a remote community in the mountains of Oaxaca, Mexico. I'd been invited to document their annual Day of the Sacred Flame Festival, a celebration that supposedly dated back over 1,000 years to pre-Columbian religious practices. What I discovered was that some traditions are too dangerous to document and too evil to preserve. I reached Santa Muerte after a 6-hour drive on mountain roads that barely qualified as paths. The village was home to maybe 300 people, nestled in a valley so remote that cell phone service was non-existent and the nearest town was 40 miles away. It was exactly the kind of isolated community where authentic traditions survive, because outside, influence is minimal. The villagers were welcoming but reserved, speaking a mixture of Spanish and what my guide told me was an indigenous dialect that few outsiders understood. The festival preparations were impressive: elaborate costumes, traditional music, and ceremonial objects that appeared to be genuine artifacts from pre-Columbian culture. But from the moment I arrived, something felt wrong about the celebration. It wasn't anything obvious. The villagers were friendly, the accommodations were adequate, and the preliminary ceremonies were beautiful displays of cultural heritage. But there was an undercurrent of tension that I couldn't identify, a sense that everyone was performing for my benefit while carefully concealing something important. The festival was scheduled to last 3 days, culminating in the sacred flame ceremony on the final night. According to the village elder, who served as my cultural guide, the ceremony involved lighting a sacred fire that would ensure the community's prosperity for the coming year. But as the festival progressed, I noticed details that didn't match the cultural context I'd been given. The ceremonial preparations included the construction of an altar that looked less like traditional indigenous religious artifacts and more like something from European witchcraft traditions. The symbols carved into the ceremonial objects weren't consistent with Mesoamerican iconography. They included elements that suggested influences from much darker spiritual practices. Most disturbing, the festival seemed to center around a single participant who would have the honor of being the sacred flame's guardian for the ceremony. This person, a young woman named Esperanza, who appeared to be in her early 20s, was treated with a combination of reverence and pity that made my skin crawl. On the second night, I had the vision that revealed what the sacred flame ceremony actually involved. I was sleeping in the small guest house the village had provided when I suddenly found myself standing in the ceremonial clearing where the final night's events would take place. But instead of watching from the perspective of a tourist documenting cultural practices, I was seeing the ceremony through Esperanza's eyes. I could feel her terror as the villagers bound her hands and led her to the altar. I could see the sacred fire was actually a pyre designed to burn a living person. I could hear the chants that weren't preserving ancient traditions, but invoking something evil that fed on human sacrifice. In the vision, I understood that the Day of the Sacred Flame wasn't a festival at all. It was an annual murder disguised as cultural preservation. Esperanza wasn't the guardian of the sacred fire. She was the fuel for it. The vision showed me that this had been happening for generations, but not for 1,000 years, as the villagers claimed. The ritual had been corrupted sometime in the colonial period, when European occult practices merged with indigenous traditions to create something that served neither culture. What the villagers called prosperity from the sacred flame was actually protection money paid to local criminal organizations who used the remote location and cultural cover to conduct activities they couldn't risk in more accessible areas. I woke up gasping, with the smell of smoke in my nostrils and the sound of Esperanza's screams echoing in my ears. The rational part of my mind tried to dismiss the vision as a nightmare triggered by being in an unfamiliar environment. But I'd been documenting cultural practices for 7 years, and I'd learned to distinguish between legitimate traditions and practices that exploited cultural preservation as cover for harmful activities. Everything about Santa Muerte's festival fit the pattern of exploitation rather than preservation. The next morning, I tried to interview Esperanza about her role in the ceremony. She was polite but evasive, and I noticed that she was never left alone with me. Whenever I approached her, other villagers would appear and redirect the conversation toward general festival topics. But I could see the fear in her eyes, and I recognized the resignation of someone who'd been told that her death was necessary for the greater good. That afternoon, I made the decision that probably saved both our lives. I told the village elder that I was feeling ill and needed to return to the nearest town for medical attention. "But Señorita Williams," he said with concern that seemed genuine, "tonight is the sacred flame ceremony. You came so far to document our traditions. I understand, and I'm very disappointed, but I'm feeling worse each hour. I think it might be altitude sickness. Perhaps you could stay for the ceremony and leave first thing in the morning. It would be such a shame for you to miss the most important part of our festival." His insistence on my staying for the ceremony confirmed my worst fears. I wasn't just there to document the ritual. I was there to legitimize it. If a respected travel blogger witnessed and wrote about the sacred flame ceremony, it would provide perfect cover for what was actually happening. I'm sorry, but I really need to get to lower altitude as soon as possible. That's when I saw the subtle signals passing between the elder and other villagers. They weren't going to let me leave. I was trapped in a remote village where my presence was being used to legitimize murder, and any attempt to escape would likely result in my death alongside Esperanza's. But I'd learned something during my years of travel blogging. Even the most isolated communities depend on connections to the outside world. Santa Muerte might be 40 miles from the nearest town, but they still needed supplies, communication, and access to services that required contact with Mexican authorities. That evening, during the preliminary ceremonies before the sacred flame ritual, I created a distraction by claiming to have lost my passport and camera equipment. While the villagers searched the guest house, I slipped away to find where they kept their vehicle, an old truck used for supply runs to town. I found more than just transportation. Hidden in the truck's tool compartment were identification documents showing that several villagers were actually members of a drug trafficking organization that used the remote location and cultural festival as cover for processing and distribution operations. The sacred flame ceremony wasn't just ritual murder, it was enforcement action designed to maintain control over local populations and eliminate potential witnesses to criminal activities. Esperanza wasn't being sacrificed to preserve ancient traditions. She was being murdered because she'd discovered something about the trafficking operation that made her a liability. I managed to start the truck and drive toward Esperanza's house before anyone realized I was missing. I found her being prepared for the ceremony, bound, drugged, and dressed in ceremonial clothing designed to make her death look like voluntary participation in cultural traditions. Getting her into the truck and driving toward the village exit required driving past the ceremonial area where the entire community was gathered. For a moment, I thought we might escape without being detected. Then I saw vehicles blocking the mountain road, newer trucks that definitely didn't belong to impoverished villagers maintaining ancient traditions. We were trapped between the village and armed criminals who weren't going to let witnesses escape alive. That's when I remembered something from my vision. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at midnight, but the real sacred flame, the one that would consume Esperanza, wouldn't be lit until 3 a.m. I had a 3-hour window to find another way out of the valley. I drove the truck off the main road and into the forest, following what looked like old logging trails that might lead over the ridge to the next valley. It was desperate and dangerous, but staying would have meant certain death for both of us. The escape took 8 hours of driving through terrain that was barely passable, with Esperanza gradually recovering from whatever drugs they'd given her and helping me navigate by stars and landmarks she remembered from childhood. We reached the next valley at dawn and found a Mexican military checkpoint. The trafficking organization apparently didn't operate in areas with regular federal presence. The investigation that followed revealed that Santa Muerte had been infiltrated by the Jalisco New Generation cartel, which used the remote location and cultural festival as cover for a methamphetamine processing facility. The annual sacrifice was actually an execution method for eliminating local residents who threatened their operation. The real villagers, those who weren't cartel members, had been terrorized into participating in the fake ceremony through threats to their families. What I'd witnessed wasn't cultural preservation, but cultural destruction, with criminal organizations using indigenous imagery to disguise systematic violence. Esperanza testified against the cartel members who'd planned to kill her, but she had to be relocated to a witness protection program because the organization had operations throughout Oaxaca. The federal raid on Santa Muerte shut down a major drug processing facility and arrested 14 cartel members, but it also destroyed a legitimate indigenous community that had been caught between preserving their traditions and protecting their lives. My article about the experience focused on how criminal organizations exploit cultural tourism and indigenous communities, but I never mentioned the vision that had shown me what the sacred flame ceremony really involved. How do you explain that you saved someone's life because you dreamed her murder before it happened? How do you tell editors that your investigation succeeded because of a premonition? Since Santa Muerte, I've been much more careful about the communities I visit and the traditions I document. I've learned to research not just cultural practices, but the economic and political contexts that shape how those practices are maintained or corrupted. The most important lesson was understanding that authenticity isn't just about preserving old traditions, it's about preserving them for the right reasons. When cultural practices become tools for exploitation rather than expressions of genuine belief, they transform from traditions worth preserving into systems that need to be exposed and stopped. But I also learned something troubling about the vulnerability of indigenous communities to outside exploitation. Santa Muerte wasn't the first village where criminal organizations had used cultural preservation as cover for illegal activities, and it won't be the last. In our enthusiasm for authentic cultural experiences, we sometimes become unwitting accomplices to the very forces that destroy the cultures we claim to respect. Have you ever participated in cultural traditions that felt wrong despite being presented as authentic heritage? Have you ever sensed that someone was using your respect for other cultures to hide activities that would horrify you if you understood what was really happening? Two individuals who ventured into spiritual communities seeking truth and found evil hiding behind facades of enlightenment and tradition. David Chen infiltrated a doomsday cult that planned mass murder disguised as spiritual liberation. Sarah Williams documented what she thought was cultural preservation, but discovered ritual murder, disguised as ancient tradition. What strikes me most about these accounts is how both cases involve the systematic corruption of human spirituality, the deliberate perversion of our deepest needs for meaning, community, and connection to something greater than ourselves. Prophet Ezekiel transformed his followers' desire for purpose into willingness to commit genocide. The Santa Muerte traffickers exploited cultural respect to mask systematic violence. Both stories reveal a disturbing truth about spiritual predation. It works by offering authentic human needs while gradually replacing genuine fulfillment with submission to evil purposes. During my follow-up interviews, I discovered that both David and Sarah experienced lasting changes in how they approach spiritual and cultural communities. David described developing an almost supernatural ability to detect manipulation techniques disguised as spiritual teaching. Sarah mentioned that she now evaluates cultural practices through filters that assess not just authenticity, but the motivations of those preserving and presenting traditions. Perhaps this is what premonitions represent in spiritual contexts: enhanced sensitivity to the difference between genuine seeking and sophisticated exploitation, even when that exploitation is wrapped in beautiful language about transcendence and cultural preservation. But there's a more unsettling aspect to both stories. In each case, the premonition revealed not just immediate danger, but entire systems of manipulation that had been operating for years without detection. David's vision exposed a cult that had spent 2 years preparing coordinated mass murder across multiple states. Sarah's revelation uncovered a criminal organization that had been using cultural festivals to disguise trafficking operations for decades. This suggests that premonitions in spiritual environments may be detecting not just individual threats, but systematic corruption of institutions and traditions that society assumes are benevolent. 6 months after these interviews, I researched other cases of premonitions within religious and cultural communities. I found accounts of individuals who sensed danger in retreat centers, ashrams, cultural festivals, and spiritual gatherings around the world, all situations where the suspension of critical thinking is presented as a spiritual virtue. In every case, the premonitions led to the discovery of exploitation, abuse, or criminal activity that had been masked by spiritual or cultural authority. This pattern suggests something deeply troubling about how predators operate in our modern world. They understand that our desire for meaning and belonging makes us vulnerable to manipulation, and they've learned to exploit that vulnerability with increasing sophistication. The most significant discovery in my research was how both individuals' premonitions led to systemic exposure of larger criminal networks. David's investigation resulted in federal raids on cult compounds in 6 states. Sarah's escape led to cartel arrests that disrupted trafficking operations throughout Oaxaca. In both cases, trusting seemingly irrational warnings produced evidence that dismantled sophisticated criminal enterprises that had been operating under spiritual or cultural cover. But the most haunting aspect of both stories is how many people remained committed to the corrupted systems, even after their evil nature was exposed. Some of Prophet Ezekiel's followers still maintain that they were planning acts of mercy. Some Santa Muerte villagers continue to defend their festival as authentic cultural preservation. This reveals perhaps the most disturbing truth about spiritual exploitation. Once people have invested their identity in a belief system, they may choose to maintain that investment even when confronted with evidence that the system is based on lies and manipulation. The corruption of spirituality doesn't just exploit our need for meaning, it transforms that need into a defense mechanism that protects the very systems that are exploiting us. This raises fundamental questions about how we distinguish between authentic spiritual experience and sophisticated psychological manipulation. How do we maintain the openness necessary for genuine spiritual growth while protecting ourselves from those who would exploit that openness? Perhaps the answer lies in understanding that authentic spirituality always enhances our capacity for critical thinking and moral judgment, while corrupt spirituality always requires us to surrender those capacities in favor of blind obedience. The most effective predators understand this distinction and work systematically to replace our natural wisdom with their artificial authority. But David and Sarah's stories also demonstrate that premonitions may be our deepest defense against spiritual exploitation, warnings that operate at levels beneath conscious manipulation, alerting us to dangers that our conditioned minds might rationalize or ignore. Have you ever found yourself in a spiritual or cultural community where questioning was discouraged and submission was praised? Have you ever sensed that someone was using your desire for meaning and belonging to control you in ways that served their purposes rather than your growth?